Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining us today on the podcast is Peter Mayer. He is a professional engineer and urban water expert and is the principal and founder of Water Demand Management. For more than 25 years, he has focused on urban water management, water use patterns, assessing the impact of water rate structures, and a whole lot more. Water is one of the most, I think, undercovered geopolitical topics in the world. It's one that I plan to be focusing on a lot more going forward and that I've been thinking about now for a long time. And Peter was very nice to make some time for us to talk. We talked a little bit about U.S.-Mexico relations in terms of water, but really about the Colorado River Basin, what's happening there in the western part of the United States, and what that means for even competition between states in the U.S. when it comes to water in general. Hopefully Peter will be willing to come back on many more times. Unfortunately, I think this is going to be an issue that is not going away. We recorded this podcast on Friday, July 29th. I think we will definitely get it up before the August 16th decision about the Colorado River Basin from the U.S. government, but it may be a week or two out before we get it posted. So if anything gets overtaken by events, please give us the benefit of the doubt. Last but not least, if I could, I would play Alan Jackson's Chattahoochee throughout the entirety of this intro, but for copyright reasons, I can't. So if you really want the full experience, go to YouTube or Spotify and play Alan Jackson Chattahoochee and listen to the sweet dulcet sounds of this bass voice introducing you to what I hope is a podcast episode you all enjoy. Jacob at cognitive.investments if you want to talk at all about what we do at CI or about the podcast itself. Otherwise, without further ado, here's Peter. Cheers. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. Peter, thanks so much for taking some time to come and talk to us about, literally probably the most important thing in the entire world, which is water. It's really nice to have you here.
Thank you so much, Jason. It's a pleasure to be here.
Jacob, I don't understand why people mix up
Jacob!
the Jacob and
the
Jason.
Shit. Let's take that again. Stop.
No,
Jacob, that's I'm so sorry.
No. I'm curious whether there's. I need a linguist.
Flew right off. Maybe it's because there's the S that I saw at the. It's like.
But it's not just you. Like whenever anybody gets my name wrong, it's always Jason.
Oh, he's Jason.
I need like a linguist.
Start with J. J is like, oh God. Anyway.
I guess so.
All right. Well, this is off to a great start.
It's off to a great start. I always thought, Jason was the Red Power Ranger, so he was cool.
Jason,
now I'm showing my age.
Jacob.
But anyway, water, literally the most important thing probably in the universe. I'm here in New Orleans where we have, I don't want to say too much water, where water is not a problem, or water is a problem when there's too much of it, not because there's a lack. You're in Boulder, Colorado, and the reason I wanted to have you on, there's lots of reasons, and I would like water to actually be one of the topics that this podcast takes up because I think there isn't enough coverage about it. But last month, a federal water official said that water levels in the Colorado River were so low that either the states involved, so there's 6 different states, we can go through that in a little bit, that depend on the Colorado River for water and for electricity production, about 40 million people depending on it. If the states can't figure out how to lower their consumption by 2 to 4 million acre feet next year, then the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation will come in and impose water cuts on the states, period. That was last month. And that stopped me in my tracks and got me paying a lot more attention to this issue. And a mutual friend hooked us up and said we should talk about this. So that's why we're here. If we're starting just with the Colorado River, where do we start? How did we get to this place, or how did we get to this moment in the first place, to where there are such dire water shortages? I don't want to say seemingly out of nowhere, because someone like you's been focusing on this for a long time, but it feels a little sudden. How did we get here?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jacob. It's a pleasure to be here. And so, how do we get here? Well, first of all, you got to understand, the Colorado River starts in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and in Wyoming and Utah, and then flows through the desert all the way down to the Gulf of California, which is between Mexico, that strip of water between Baja California and Mexico. Um, when it was first explored by Westerners, John Wesley Powell, one of his immediate comments was that this river will never support a massive population. It's just not that big. Um, so we're starting from the standpoint of this is the resource we have, the Colorado River. So then what happens is it is developed, and over the last 100 years or 100 plus years, that the river has been aggressively developed uh, with series of dams, including two of the largest reservoirs in the United States, Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Um, and which stores millions and millions and millions of gallons of water. And the as part of the development of the Colorado River, we have the creation in the 1920s of the Colorado River Compact, which divided up the river between the 7 basin states. The 3 upper basin states, which are Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, and then the 4 lower basin states, New Mexico, which actually gets some Colorado River water, Nevada, Arizona, and of course, California. So those are really the key players. But guess who was totally forgotten in the compact division well, Mexico was included to some extent, but they completely neglected tribes, Native American tribes along the river who had an established long-term claim. So some of those tribal rights have been resolved, some have not. But the river was divided up, and so they forgot a bunch of things, and then they divided it up based on a measurement of about 16 or 17 million acre feet per year. And that's a lot of water. And it turns out that was based on some pretty wet years. They sort of cherry picked or happily cherry picked. I don't know what you want to describe it. But they selected a historical time record for the hydrology, which enabled them to consider a large volume of water to be divided up. And then we went henceforth. So then what happens over time is the lower basin in particular grows into its allocation. And so the lower basin actually began and exceeds its allocation until finally the feds asked California to stop overusing. You also have a Supreme Court fight between Arizona and California, which eventually establishes California as the senior right and Arizona as the junior right. And then you also have the upper basin also growing, but never using their full allocation. So the upper basin has always had this view: hey, we've still got more. We've never used our full allocation, and then we proceed into our current hydrology. The last 20 years, the lakes were actually full. Both all the reservoirs were full. As late as don't quote me, I think it's around 2000. So it was around within certainly within our lifetimes. And then we essentially entered this massive dry period, drought, which has reduced the snowpack, reduced the runoff at the same time that people were taking more water also. And then that has then depleted the lakes. Now, some people saw this coming a long time. But I think for most of the country, it is a surprising wake-up call how quickly Lake Powell and Lake Mead have depleted down to a level where Lake Mead, is 145 feet above the level which it will stop being able to generate hydroelectric power. So and that in itself, stopping generating electricity will be have significant impact for the cost of electricity, for how electricity is generated in the West. So it's a significant event, and it's a climate change event. But it's also a human-caused event because it's the result of human planning, essentially, like planning to use X amount of water, and Mother Nature essentially not providing that amount of water.
Yeah, I'll put a link for listeners to a bunch of different things in the description to this podcast. One will be the sort of NASA satellite images that they've made available of Lake Mead in particular, and it has the thing where you can scroll over and see where it was in 2000 and where it was in 2022, and you got the years exactly right. To your point, in 2000, looks fine, looks great, even that deep midnight blue color and everything's filled in, and now you look at it, it's like positively frightening and anemic. And there's also there's this idea that the New York Times reported this, and I think NASA had this too, but that the region is facing its worst drought in 12 centuries. They've apparently looked at tree rings and decided that this is the driest that the climate has been since 800 in CE. That's what those of us who went to Jewish day school say is
Right,
AD.
the Common Era.
The Common Era. It's
Yes.
stuck in my head. I'm going to ask a fairly naive and stupid question to tee you up. Is there a chance that this reverses itself, that we get years of plenty after years of drought, and then it fills up even more? Because my understanding of climate change is that we get periods of volatility, so things will get bad and then things will get good. Is there any reason to think that nature is going to bail us out here, or is there something with the hydrology that is basically saying, well, even if you got more rain, the current system's not going to work?
This is a tough one because people really want to hear that there's a chance. You're telling me there's a chance, and I am telling. I don't want to say there isn't some chance because with nature, Mother Nature is very unpredictable. But the outlook that we're seeing right now is extreme. Is more dry. Certainly for the next year at least, and beyond that, it's really hard to know. Could we have another wet period? Yes, we certainly could have another wet period. The problem is it took a long time to fill up Lake Powell and Lake Mead when we had really good hydrology and when we didn't have a lot of uses on the river. And so the chances of refilling the lakes, even with good hydrology, are very limited simply because the demands on the river will be so great that whatever flows in is unlikely to be stored. That's why the level of cuts that they're asking for between 2 million and 4 million acre feet. Now think about that, because really what that's saying is that we think this river is only producing maybe 10 or 11 million acre feet. Because that's the level of cuts that they're, and if that's really what it's only going to produce, and they still need to leave, I don't know, how much they can leave in the lake each year to try to preserve or restore some lake level, it becomes a math problem.
This is also, forgive a naive question, but I'm learning from the ground up, and I'm hoping that my listeners will appreciate that I'm willing to ask basic and more elementary questions of an expert like you. Let's say that the worst happened and it did go to Deadpool status, or if it went even below that. Is there something, when it comes to hydrology, is there a point of no return with some of these lakes and rivers? Like, do you get low enough to where it doesn't matter anymore? It can't regenerate itself if you do have good policy and smart usage, or can you actually start to repair some of this damage if you are intentional from a policy perspective about being better about usage and all those other things?
Well, it's interesting you say regenerative, because in some ways the shrinking of the lake is returning the river more to its more natural state. The lake was an artificial creation of human beings by putting a dam on that river. So is there a possibility of restoring the lake levels? I think is more really, and it could happen, but it would require extremely favorable hydrology and massive demand reductions at the same time. I think. In terms of let's imagine what happens. So let's say the first thing is that they might choose to say let's keep only one lake. So they'll say let's say we keep Lake Mead. So they'll let Lake Powell, they'll let all the water that they can go out of Lake Powell. They'll try to fill up Lake Mead, and they won't try to hold water back in Lake Powell. They'll try to move it as much as they can down to Lake Mead to keep that lake up. I mean, that is a possibility that has been proposed by some. Nobody knows if that would work or not, or whether water could flow even successfully. One of the questions is whether if Lake Powell, if the level drops below a certain point, can even 7.5 million acre feet, which is the requirement to the lower basin, can that amount be delivered every year? Just physically through the infrastructure. So there are huge questions related to that. If either of these lakes though drops below some of these levels, many people's water supply is endangered, and we'd have to change the way that they get water. So Page, Arizona, for instance, when Lake Powell drops below a certain point, they will no longer be able to withdraw water. So they would need to, stick a hose in and, establish some sort of a pumping system or some temporary, but more likely to become permanent. This is why Las Vegas saw this coming, and they dug a tunnel underneath Lake Mead, and they created essentially a bathtub drain at the bottom of Lake Mead, which is where they can withdraw water. So that even as the lake levels drop, they will still be able to withdraw water from Lake Mead, even far beyond dead pool.
I also want to tee you up to, I think one of the things that's been talked about recently, or I think last year, the Arizona state legislature was urging Congress again to look at diverting water via a pipeline from the Mississippi River all the way to the Colorado River, which, as somebody who lives on the Mississippi River, I mean, first of all, haven't we done enough to the Mississippi River? Like, I feel like my house is going to get washed out one day as soon as river control fails, but we're going to build and I don't know, I think, but the U.S. even did a study. So they spent the money to do a study, apparently in 2012, I was reading it, and concluded it would take 30 years and something like $15 billion. But it makes me a little concerned, though, because it feels like we're still casting about for fanciful solutions rather than actually dealing with the reality in front of us, which is the amount of population that is there cannot handle the water resources that are there.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it, Jacob. There's a lot of funny expressions you can use. You can call it, grasping at long straws, far-fetched water. That's really what we're talking here. It's not that there isn't enough water in the Mississippi necessarily, but the pumping and the energy that would be required to move the water consistently and would be tremendous. And perhaps if we had an unlimited supply of clean energy, then this might be something to be thought about. If you had all the money in the world. But the truth is, we don't have all the money. We don't have the energy would make our climate situation even worse because we would be burning more fossil fuels to pump the water. The much more logical solution is if there's not enough water in Arizona for those people should move somewhere where there's more water. And that is what has happened throughout human history as different civilizations have confronted water shortage. Ultimately, populations have to move to where there is sufficient supply.
Yeah, well, human history has never met Americans, I guess, for better and for worse.
We are humans, believe it or not. Yeah, we're going to be susceptible to all the same forces that impacted all other civilizations. And resource shortages is one that, and water shortages is one. I mean, even in the American West, I mean, we have the Mesa Verde is a wonderful example, of the ancient Pueblo people, built these beautiful cities and then had to abandon them. And they essentially think it was the drought. Maybe it was that drought from 800 or so that you were talking about that they measured.
Yeah, I want to hit it at a little bit of a geopolitical level before we start talking about relations between states, which is also a geopolitical level in and of itself. But the Rio Grande is also, I guess, part of this same general environment. I don't think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I
It's
don't
part
think
of the
there's.
same system. Believe it or not, the Rio Grande is augmented with water from the Colorado River.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these basins are connected. The Colorado provides extra water that flows into the Rio Grande Basin, and that flows into the South Platte Basin, which then eventually would make it to the Missouri and the Mississippi. And I'm sure I'm neglecting another one, but it really is heavily used and exported in the upper basin. So it's the Rio Grande though is an even drier part and has an even more vulnerable source because it's the southern Rockies which have been getting less and less and less snow. I think
Mm-hmm.
the Rio Grande dried up in Albuquerque just this week for the first time in 40 years, and of course it reforms below Albuquerque as their wastewater treatment plant effluent is put back into the river. The irony is that Albuquerque pumps groundwater essentially, flushes it, and then treats it, and then puts it back into the Rio Grande.
Yeah, that makes my brain hurt. But
Sorry, but that's
no, that's why you're here, and my listeners' brains need to hurt as well about this particular issue. But I was also, I mean, the famous Porfirio Diaz, who's a former Mexican dictator, quote is "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." I was doing a little bit of research on the Mexico-U.S. water relationship, and I actually remember right when I started my own consulting firm. Sort of one of the first things that happened after COVID was this clash between Mexican farmers in Chihuahua and Mexican soldiers because the United States and Texas Governor Greg Abbott was saying that Mexico owes us water that they haven't given us. And the farmers in Mexico were like, well, we don't want to send the Texans water. We'd like to keep the water. And they were preventing it. And apparently it all goes back to a 1944 treaty where basically the U.S. makes a deal with Mexico where it's like we get a lot of the water, you get a little bit, and that's it. But one of the stats that I found in there, to your point earlier, I mean, at that time, apparently the 1940s was also a very wet time period, which is when that treaty came through, and the population of both Mexico and the U.S. on those sides, all in all these different basin environments was 560,000, and now it's 10 million. And so now it's not just, I mean, it does become, I think, a geopolitical issue here between the United States and Mexico, because it's one thing for the federal government to come in and say, hey, guys, if you're not going to compromise with each other, we're going to make decisions for you. But two Mexican states also get water from the Colorado River. So is the Bureau of Reclamation going to go to Mexico City and say, hello, President AMLO, if you can't make a compromise with us, we'll also be making decisions for you? I mean, that seems to be that looks like it could be a major conflict, I think, between Mexico and the United States going forward.
It could be. It's probably more likely that it'll be worked out financially, and I would imagine that will be how it's worked out with agricultural users. So I mean, so let's talk about the 2 million to 4 million acre feet of cuts that they're looking for in the Colorado River, and how are we going to get there? And what? So first of all, the states are in the process of negotiating right now, and they have a deadline of August 16th to reach agreement on how to get those cuts themselves. So the best solution would be the states come to agreement and present a plan to achieve those cuts. And the thing is, it's not just for this year. The Bureau has said that they need to plan for this for the next 4 years. And I think the what's really lurking in people's mind is this permanent? And I think many people are trying to get people others around the basin to accept that this could well be permanent, and that we could be looking at a basin that only produces 11 million acre feet or maybe less even annually, and that's more the real what we need to deal with. But we're still have a lot of people who have not come to any level of acceptance around something along those lines. So the states have until the 16th to reach agreement. The likelihood of them doing that is probably not too great, let's just say. Yeah. I think it's much more likely that the federal government is going to have to come in and mandate cuts. Now, they clearly have the ability to mandate the cuts in the lower basin. And most of the cuts would probably come from agriculture. The Imperial Irrigation District in Southern California holds one of the largest shareholders of water. I think that the only question is, will they be compensated? If they are compensated, how much will it be? Is it like one-time money? Is it permanent? How does that all work out? Then will they be able to curtail water from the upper basin if it comes to it? That is a real question. I mean, certainly last year they mandated releases from upper basin reservoirs that they controlled, like Flaming Gorge and Blue Mesa. So it's possible that they could, say, okay, maybe we can't tell you to do X, Y, or Z, but we can release water from these reservoirs. I mean, so there's some way, they may have some way of, but that could in itself could stimulate the legal action from the upper basin to say what against the federal government. I mean, the upper basin has an argument. I mean, their argument is the compact says that we had to deliver 7.5 million acre feet, on average. And we've done that. We've never not done that. We've always delivered that. We've sometimes delivered a lot more than that. And we've never used our full amount. So why is it our problem up here? We're looking down at you guys who are essentially overusing that have caused the problem. So I mean, and that's essentially this bargaining position that they're starting from in the upper basin, and they're also saying that the federal government don't actually have the legal authority to curtail us the same way that you do to the lower basin.
So walk me through that then, and maybe this gets into some of your other experience in different water conflicts in the United States. But so let's say, for the sake of argument, the lower basin has no choice; it has to do what the federal government says. But if the upper basin challenges that, what happens next? Do they get to keep taking the water until the appeal process gets resolved all the way up into the Supreme Court? Are they supposed to stop the water until the appeal process is started? Talk to me a little bit about the mechanics of how that works.
Well, this would be real. This would be a lawyer's, can I say, wet dream?
Yes,
because I mean, these Supreme Court's cases are very rare, and they take years, and they make law firms a lot of money. It'd be very interesting. So let's say the states don't reach agreement. Well, let's look at the most typical way that the conflict might be. The most typical way a conflict happens is one state says to another state, like California said to Arizona, we don't like what you're doing, and you sue them, or what happened more recently between Florida and Georgia. Over completely different river basin. But they sue each other, and that case goes to the Supreme Court. And it's a state case between the states, and then there's a trial before a special master and the whole thing. But what we're looking at the Colorado River is somewhat different, because now the federal government, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Department of Interior, is coming in to say, we, the federal government, are going to mandate the cuts. So let's say a state, maybe Colorado or Utah or somewhere else in the upper basin, doesn't like what the federal government says are the cuts. They can sue the federal government. Now, would that go to the Supreme Court right away, like a interstate conflict, or would it maybe then go to a federal court? I'm not actually sure what court would have jurisdiction in the fight between a state and the federal government. Mm-hmm. The same way, I mean, it probably would have to go to the Supreme Court also, but it might have a different path than if it's a conflict between two states.
Well, but do you know that if, while we're waiting while the whole process is going on,
what would happen while we wait?
Yeah.
That is, I mean, typically, like, it's the court that decides. It's kind of like, does the guy go to stay in jail, or do I, give him bail and let him go free? It's like, do I allow the federal government to mandate these cuts? Probably that's what you think they would do because of the crisis, and then, the objection would have to go through. But maybe they would, if the state made a compelling case, they would say, okay, the state could keep using the water as they were, and you federal government can go pound sand until the case is proven. I mean,
Yeah.
it's anytime you get to a court situation with water, there is tremendous uncertainty, and that is why it is always, always, always better to try to settle it without taking it to court, and to reach in some sort of an agreement where all the parties have some buy-in, rather than a judge who is not a water expert and may not understand the situation the same way makes the decision.
I'm imagining in my head a judge setting bail for the water at 1 million acre feet or something a year, and then they can go forward. But I think that's a nice segue into. So we've talked about the Colorado and doom and gloom and some things that are more abstract and some uncertainties. But you've had some significant experience. You already alluded to it in this water conflict between my birth state of Georgia and the state of Florida, neither one of which strike me as particularly water stressed, but as an example of interstate water conflict just within the U.S. itself. So why don't you walk us through that particular case study, and maybe we can tease out some implications or lessons for thinking about water in general in the U.S.
Sure. Well, I can tell you that. So I was hired by the state of Georgia to be their expert in municipal and industrial water efficiency for the case of the U.S. Supreme Court when they were sued by the state of Florida. And the case itself was not it was completely different than what we've been talking about in the Colorado River, because it wasn't about, is there enough water for people? This is actually a case that was about, is there enough water for oysters and for fisheries? The river in Florida that is the Apalachicola, and this is a river that flows through the panhandle of Florida. The river itself originates, though, way up north in Georgia, and actually then also again just south of Atlanta. There's two different rivers. There's the Chattahoochee River, which starts up north of Atlanta, and then there's the Flint River, which starts, I think it's right under the airport. It might even be the headwaters, technically. But then those two rivers flow south, eventually join at Lake Seminole, which is an artificial lake with a dam that's right at the border between Florida and Georgia. And then they release water from that dam, Lake Seminole, into the Appalachia, what then becomes the Apalachicola River, and that river flows through the Panhandle into Apalachicola Bay, and Apalachicola Bay is a prize oyster fishery for Florida, and it's an important cultural place, beautiful location, a lot of things that happen there. So what happened? Well, what happened was that in 2010 we had the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and there was a threat to that oyster fishery, and so there was actually a sort of a salvage harvest. What they did, so they tried to say, we better get what we can before this oil spill destroys everything. They overfished the fishery at that point. Then a couple years later, when the fishery was depleted, they decided to sue Georgia, and the Florida essentially what I would argue was a politically motivated lawsuit from the governor Rick Scott, who's now the senator Rick Scott. But for whatever reason, they believe that they might have a chance of winning, and they've been in conflict with Georgia for many years over water. So they decided to take it all the way to the Supreme Court. And so they sued them over Georgia's water use, basically saying that because they weren't getting enough fresh water coming into this estuary, the fish and the oysters were dying. But they specified the oysters. The key thing was the oysters. In court, they tried to say a bunch of other things were damaged, but they never really made the case. The oysters are the only species they really presented any evidence about, related to salinity and things like that. So the case itself, though, represented to the state of Georgia an existential threat to their entire water supply. I mean, the Apalachicola and the Flint rivers are the source of water for Atlanta and all of metropolitan Atlanta, and then flowing down to a number of other cities into southern Georgia, and also Georgia agriculture in the South. And so Georgia took this extremely seriously. Both sides have hired the absolute top legal teams, and then they both bring in experts from all over the country to basically duke it out over this case. So I got brought in by Georgia to help them to defend essentially the municipal and urban water use in Atlanta, and to examine that water use history. And eventually what we were able to show is how much the water use had come down, and how, frankly, progressive a lot of the policies, the urban water management policies in Georgia had been, mandating efficient fixtures even before the federal government had done it. They were one of the first states to require water loss control and mandatory leak audits for water systems, and it had a real impact. You can see the declining trend in overall water use and in per capita water use. So the story was very good. The other thing that was a key thing for that I had to explain, was that most of the water that's used in a place like Atlanta is not used outdoors. It's actually, they have much higher indoor water use. Most of that water then ends up back in the wastewater treatment system and then back into the river. And so it's not really consumed the same way that water is in the West, the same way where you pull it out, and if you dump it on a landscape or a farm, it never makes it back to the river. Indoor use is much more of a pass-through. As it is treated and put back, as we talked about earlier with Albuquerque. Yeah. And so in Georgia, they actually intentionally don't practice a lot of water reuse, because they understand the importance of putting that water back in and keeping the river as whole as possible for the next user downstream.
There's a little bit of cognitive dissonance for me, because I'm not used to Georgia being at the front or the forefront of anything. So I'm glad to hear that my birth state is leading the charge, at least on this particular issue.
Yeah, on urban conservation. Now, I think the pumping, the agricultural pumping was the weaker part of Georgia's case. But even in that one, Florida was never able to prove or connect the pumping, the Georgia's agricultural water use with the depletion of water. And it really came down to what the minimum flow releases were, which turns out to be 5,000 CFS. It was the minimum flow release from that dam into the Apalachicola. Now, in the western United States, 5,000 CFS is a massive amount of water. So the fact that was what it wasn't somehow not enough, is kind of a cognitive dissonance for water engineers in the West. But ultimately, what happened was, after an 8-year process with this case, and a 5-week trial before a special master, and then 2 different special masters actually ultimately. The case was found unanimously in favor of Georgia. And they basically said, Florida, you didn't prove your case. You didn't show, you didn't prove to us that, it was Georgia's water use that has caused this injury, and, we need to have, it needs to be beyond a reasonable doubt for us to essentially do what amounts to a takings. You're taking from one state to another, and you're damaging the economy of Georgia. And that was the other thing that was very persuasive. The economy of Georgia that relied on the water was massive, billions and billions and billions of dollars. The value of the oyster fishery in the Apalachicola Valley was estimated at $10 million a year. So somebody said that I think one expert said that the economy of the Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, which is the Atlanta airport, in of itself was larger than the entire panhandle of Florida. So in an economic balancing, like if they were going to say, okay, well, so let's say we are going to carve up this water, who wins, who's more. I mean, Georgia was like, it was hugely, massively different, So that was also added to their decision, just to say, you didn't make the case. There's no way we're going to, damage this other state. And so that's the same kind of thinking, though, that will come into play in the Colorado River. If two states get into conflict, if the states get in conflict with the feds, at some point, a judge or somebody is going to look, is somebody being damaged here? Who's being damaged? And how should this water be carved up?
Yeah. Do you have before I pick up that point, do you know what happened to the oyster fisheries on the Appalachia? I mean,
they came back. They have actually done a bit better. So, it's an endangered fisheries, but there are many reasons for it, including a lot of the practices of Florida of dredging, and it's a whole complicated story. It's and also in wet years, as long as there isn't a drought, they're going to get plenty of flow from from the dam. So the operational agreement that they have now, as long as there is sufficient water, there's not going to be a problem. And it's only really in the drought years that it will be a problem. For the fishery potentially.
Yeah. Well, correct me if I'm wrong. So, but applying that to what's happening on the Colorado, I mean, I guess on the one hand, we have multiple states. So I guess you could get multiple states trying to gang up on each other or say, hey, this is all Arizona's fault. So you have that sort of dynamic. But then also, I mean, Georgia and Florida, I guess it's trying to prove injury. But isn't correct me if I'm wrong, one of the other sort of really difficult things with the Colorado is that we're talking about water usage, and every one of those states has completely different rules about how to use the different water and what you can do with it. And I don't know how much the federal government can intervene to tell those states, well, you have to do if the water is theirs, does the federal government have control to actually go in? And that seems like a gray line to me. I mean, it
Right.
seems like it's going to be a much more. I mean, if that took 8 years and everything that you're talking about, maybe we could build that pipeline from the Mississippi River in the amount of time.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. And the last Supreme Court case on the Colorado River took 15 years. So everybody thought, I think the thinking was always that if there was going to be a Supreme Court case on the Colorado, it was going to be the lower basin suing the upper basin because they hadn't delivered 7.5 million acre feet per year. Somehow, the compact had been violated because the lower basin wasn't getting the water that they were promised in the compact. But that's not really what's happened. So instead, what now looks like might be more the case would be some like the upper basin suing either the lower basin or maybe the federal government, perhaps, if they are curtailed, in some way, because saying that this is wrong, we haven't done anything wrong. It's not our problem. Why are you punishing us? I mean, that would essentially be the argument. So that's the balancing. It's kind of flipped the script on how people thought the conflict in Colorado might play out. And part of it is because of the history, which there has been a Supreme Court case in the lower basin. We had California versus Arizona. So there is already an understanding of where the priorities lie. Nevada's claim is very small. And they've always taken less than their claimed stated amount anyway. So Nevada actually has been able to play an important intermediary role because their claim to the river gets them a seat at the table, but volumetrically it's so small that they're not, it's like not there. You could cut them off and it doesn't solve your problem at all, type of thing. So they can even if they contribute 10%, it's literally a drop in the bucket compared to what really needs to be saved.
Yeah, the other bit of this that we've kind of touched on, but really not kind of focused on that much is just, I mean, it's not just that there are 40 million people that we're talking about here whose access to water, that's a big deal if they're going to lose access to water. But there's also remarkably a lot of agriculture in this part of the
Yes,
United
yeah, a lot
States.
of food that that fills grocery stores, and then a lot of animal food and animal fodder that feeds the meat that we eat, and then also that some of which gets exported. So if you want to start looking, I think anything that gets exported ought to be seems like the obvious place to start. Um, that puts a value on the product rather than maybe on the land, or I mean, in other ways to think about it might be, well, what would be the most advantageous water to essentially not to use. um, so there's the balancing act, and then ultimately it may be who is willing to be paid for not to use their water. And then ultimately perhaps it will be who are they capable of cutting off. So the big question will, not the big question, a big question is the compensation. And so if you think about, let's say it's 2.5 million acre feet of water that we have to save, and so let's say that they wanted to pay people, so you're not going to get this water, but at least we're going to pay you for it. Well, for every $100, a 2.5 million, you get to 250 million at $100 an acre foot, which is too low, honestly. $200 to $250 an acre foot is probably more of the going rate, and I've heard tell that some places we're talking more 400 or 500. So then you're up to a billion pretty quick just for 1 year. Now, what if you had to buy the water forever? What if you say, okay, really we need 2.5 million acre feet, and it's going away. You're never going to be able to use it again. We're going to just buy it off of you. Then you're probably talking more in the neighborhood of $50,000 an acre foot. I don't know. They could vary up and down the river. What it ultimately is. In Colorado, it goes for more than that some places. But let's just say that it was $50,000, which is a lot of money for an acre foot. Then you get it to something like 150 billion. I mean, it's astronomical. I'm not sure that they can print the money fast enough to possibly do that. I mean, it's like the pipeline. It's like it just don't seem like that's really reasonable, that amount of money. Maybe I don't think big enough, but so that's the problem with the compensation is like is there going to be enough money? The smart money might be get paid now because they might spend it all and there's not going to be any money later. I don't know. This is a really, really complex problem, and human beings have to solve it.
Is there any reason to be optimistic? Do you have? I mean, you're in Boulder. I assume you're working on this issue in general. Do you have hope? Do you have hope that there is a solution of some kind?
Well, there is a solution. It's just right there in front of us. I mean, we could curtail agriculture majorly. We could also, urban should do their share, but it's going to be, ultimately a smaller component of it. And we need to do it in a way where, preferably you don't completely sever water from the land, and you do it in a way that makes people whole and compensates them for it. The problem is we don't have a lot of time. And so that we had some time, to think about this over the last few years. And, we had a lot of posturing, and, there's a lot of meetings and discussion, but not a real lot of serious action about how to do it. Now it's going to come in a more painful manner. And it may not be left up to people in the way that they would like. And so that's it. We're in for some interesting times. I do have hope. Because we have a strong infrastructure system itself. And so if we're able to manage our political system and just simply stop withdrawing the water and manage that political decision not to do that, and the consequences of that, I do think there's a hope for stabilizing the reservoirs. I'm not sure we can refill the reservoirs, but if we can establish a stabilized level, then everyone has to learn how to live on the hydrology of the time of that year. And that means you upper basin may have to use less water than and you certainly are not going to have the aspirations. You thought you were going to have more water withdrawal. No, what you have now is all you're getting. Whether I don't know whether they would have the chutzpah to cut off the program. There's a few projects that are already underway. They started digging for new extractive projects here in Colorado and possibly elsewhere. That would be pretty painful for them to say stop that reservoir expansion, stop that Trans Mountain diversion. But if they did that, it would be a really strong statement of how serious they are. And it might be within their power to pull a permit or something like that. It's very interesting. I don't know what is going to happen or exactly how it's going to happen, but I do know that we're going to have to mind our water use a lot more.
Well, and I guess also, I mean, you're living in Colorado, so in some ways, your chips are on the table in that regard too.
30% of Boulder's water comes from the Colorado River underneath the mountains. 50% of Denver's water comes from the Colorado River under the mountains. So the Front Range in Colorado is heavily dependent on the Colorado River. I think to a degree that many people haven't realized up until this point. So it could be a wake up call for the Front Range too.
Yeah, Peter. Before I let you go, tell us how you got into water, because I know you have an interesting backstory about how you got here in the first place. So now we've talked about the doom and gloom. Let's just talk about how is it that you got into this particular field a long time ago before anybody was worrying about it the way people worry about it today.
Yeah, well, so I went to Oberlin College and I was an anthropology major, cultural anthropology. And I was fortunate enough to win a scholarship or fellowship, actually, upon graduation to go and teach in India. So I left to live in South India for 2 years right after college. And I ended up living in South India for 4 years, so I did 2 years on this fellowship, and then I worked for the University of Wisconsin for their college year abroad. And it was really while living in Tamil Nadu, India, that I started to pay attention to water issues. And it really, it sort of opened my eyes. I think it's been right in front of me here in Boulder too, but it opened my eyes to the significance of water. And at that point in my career, I was thinking that I might like to work in international development, and I wanted to get a technical degree, so I have something to contribute. I wasn't, I have some knowledge. So I came back to the University of Colorado to get a master's degree in civil engineering. So even though I had an undergraduate degree in arts and sciences, I was able to do a master's degree in engineering. It took me 3 years. I had to take some background courses. And then it took me an even longer period of time after that to earn my professional engineering license. But that's how I eventually got into the water world. While I was doing my master's degree, I decided I wanted to work on a research project and do a thesis rather than a coursework option. Mm-hmm. And so I knocked on some doors, and eventually a professor said, "Sure, I think I have a project for you." And he introduced me to a guy who was working on a project in the city of Boulder where they were installing these devices called data loggers, which is basically a recording device, and attaching it to the water meter. And then what it did is that as water flows through the meter, the recording device would record the flow every 10 seconds. And because we recorded it every 10 seconds, you got this very detailed, what we call flow trace that basically shows, how the water is going into the home. And then we developed a software program that disaggregated it into toilets and clothes washers and irrigation and all the different ways that people use water. And so I began researching residential and then non-residential water use in the United States using this technology, and ended up authoring a number of large research studies, the residential end uses of water, as well as a variety of other reports. So that's how eventually I found my way at the Supreme Court, was through working with water utilities and doing research and planning for urban water supplies that include water conservation.
I wonder, were there any lessons, particularly from your time in India, that still stick with you today, or things that you saw there that still, because I mean, India, arguably, I mean, let's not say the most, one of the most water stressed countries in the world. They make our water policy look positively forward thinking and progressive based on the way that they've been like churning through their water resources as well. But did you take anything away from that experience, or anything that you still carry from that experience that informs the way you look at these things today?
Very much so. So the first thing that I was really surprised to learn was that very few people, even in cities, were on a public water supply system. And let's say you all were fortunate enough to be on a public water supply system. In most cities in India, the water is not 24/7. The water would only be provided typically a few hours a week. And what would happen then is, your essentially water would be turned on to your portion of town for, between 2 and 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon or whatever it is. Everybody in that then knows it's going to happen and is ready. They open up every tap in the house, and you have a bucket and a basin, and you are filling up everything you can. You also have a roof tank too that you're trying to store as much water as possible for during that 2 hour period. And then you rely on that. And then when that runs out, there's a truck that might come by that where you can fill up a pod or something like that. That's people who are fortunate enough to be on an urban water supply. So then was a huge number of other people who just weren't on any kind of a urban system. They had their own well. And so this is actually the wealthier people who tended to be maybe more in the suburban outlying areas. They drill their own wells. In some places, that's fine. Actually, the groundwater was pretty low, and the monsoon, and there was a lot of moisture, and fairly regular water supply. Occasionally, you had to deepen the wells, not too bad. But as the population grows, the wells are getting deeper and deeper and deeper. In some places, it is absolute groundwater mining, along the lines of what we're seeing in the United States, where you have these super deep wells and you're mining ancient groundwater. If the groundwater is being replenished, regularly, it's not a big deal. Then that's what you want to use. But if it's ancient water, thousands and thousands of years old, that is not a renewable water source, and that's where India is going to really bump into problems. They use way less water. That's the other thing that I take with me from India, is that I've worked my entire career to try to reduce American water use, and we've got it down from 69 gallons per person per day for indoor use down now to closer to 45 or maybe even 42 gallons per person per day. That's through efficient toilets and clothes washers and dishwashers and low flow shower heads and things that then they've really worked. People in India rely on so much less water. I mean, so it is possible. I mean, maybe it's not the world that we want to live in, but human beings have proven the ability to survive with way less water. And so I take a lot of optimism from our ability to adapt. I don't think it's hard, and it's not something that we necessarily want to think about, but we can do it. We can use less water. We can have a good life and use less water. We can have a nice landscape, I think, and use less water. I think there's a whole future in the Western United States of landscapes that rely mostly on available precipitation. And in some years they're gorgeous, and some years they're not as good. But there's that's a cultural change that's required to get there. But I'm optimistic. We're not going to have any choice. We've dealt ourselves a hand with climate change. Where the chances of seeing these really wet years, these rescue years, is very slim. The real chances are that it's going to be hotter and drier, and that the hot summers that we're living through now are really the coolest ones of the rest of our lives. So if that is the much more likely future, then we really are going to have to accept adaptation if we want to keep living, especially in a lot of parts of the Western United States. I contend that a lot of people may decide they want to move. I think some people may just decide, it's too hot in Arizona. It makes a lot more sense for me to live closer to the Mississippi, where the pipeline could be a lot shorter. You know, so we'll see. I think within our lifetimes we may see some surprising population swings related to water supply. Maybe. Or, maybe we'll be able to conserve, and to curtail ourselves into some sort of a stasis that's manageable. But we're definitely not going to be able to grow gangbusters, endlessly into the future. It is a limited resource. Something's got to give.
Yeah. Well, if Arizonans are thinking about moving on the Mississippi, I would just say make sure that you account for the fact that the Mississippi will probably hop into the Atchafalaya here at some point and wipe out a large amount of the things that are underneath it. And it's a measure of how much I love my wife that I let her kidnap me and bring me here down to New Orleans. But I'm looking forward to my front row seat for it all. But that's a topic maybe for next time. I can
that is, yeah, a human being's inability to accept the reality of the floodplain is a whole other question that we could talk about.
How about we leave that one for next time and hope that you'll come back, Peter, and thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Jacob, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.